Welcome to the Urbana Sustainability Advisory Commission meeting. Will staff please call the roll?
I can't hear Scott.
Yeah, Scott, we're not hearing you right now.
Do you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry, headset's not working. James Corbin. Tomas Delgado.
Here.
Madeline Garbaz.
Here.
Stacy Gloss.
Here.
Jessica Lemkool.
Here.
Andrew Stump. Morgan White.
Here.
Grace Wilkin.
Here. Okay, great. We have a quorum this evening. So hi, everybody. Tonight's meeting format is a little bit different than our typical SAC Sustainability Advisory Council meetings. Tonight's meeting is still an official public meeting of the Sustainability Advisory Commission, and the Commission will take care of some required business, such as approving minutes from a previous meeting and have public comment at the beginning of the meeting as stated on the agenda. So we'll go ahead and we'll move into approving the minutes from the last meeting. Commission members received a copy of the meeting minutes from February in their packet, rather March. We do need a motion to approve March's SAC meeting minutes.
So moved.
I have a motion to approve with just one adjustment that we omitted something that was copied over. I think
Okay,
I already got that taken care of.
perfect. Thank you. So motion to approve the minutes as adjusted. I guess we do need to call the roll for approval.
Tomas Delgado.
Yes.
Madeline Garbaz.
Yes.
Stacy Gloss.
Yes.
Jessica Lemkool.
Yes.
Andrew Stump.
Yes.
Morgan White.
Yes.
Grace Wilkin.
Yes.
Okay, motion passes. Thank you. Okay, next in tonight's agenda is public comment. Please keep in mind that this evening, the SAC meeting has been devoted to the subject of Emulsicoat's operations in Urbana, specifically their facility on University Avenue. Representatives from both the Illinois EPA and Emulsicoat will provide introductions and some background information before moving into a public question and answer session that will happen later in the meeting tonight. In the spirit of the format that I just outlined, if you have questions or comments about Emulsicoat and wish to have a response to your question, you may consider holding off from public comment in this just upcoming public comment section until the Q&A portion of the agenda later on. But right now we'll take public comment on whatever topic or topics that attendees would like. If you would like to make a public comment, please raise your hand in the chat to be called on. Each speaker will have 3 minutes, and the public input portion of the meeting shall total no more than 1 hour unless otherwise shortened or extended by majority vote of the public body members present. Are there any attendees that would like to raise their hand and address the commission and public comment currently? Okay, looks like everybody here in attendees this evening are going to be here for the Emulsicoat discussion. The Illinois EPA staff will begin with a short presentation, then followed by a representative from Emulsicoat. They've each been invited to spend about 10 minutes to provide brief introductory presentations, and then we'll move into questions and answers. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead to introduce our Illinois Environmental Protection Agency representative. I believe we do have several members here tonight from the Illinois EPA, but I think that Chris Presnell, is he here? Hi, Chris. We'll be,
Hello.
we'll be presenting on some background information related to the air quality permits. He is the Environmental Justice Coordinator for the Illinois EPA. Chris, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Hello. I'll go ahead and introduce the other staff that we have with us as well. One person with the Illinois EPA is Julie Armitage, who will be attending. She is the chief of the Bureau of Air. She's going to I think she's going to do most of the talking about the Amalsaco facility, recent permitting situation. I think as a lot of people probably attending know, my office sent out an environmental justice notification letter, which is designed really to alert the public to a well, before I get into that, I realize I'm talking, I want to introduce at least one more person. Brad Frost, I see his name on here. He's the manager of the Office of Community Relations. So the three of us represent three sort of different areas at the Illinois EPA that work closely together. The Bureau of Air, who is sort of the technical staff, the staff that permits, enforcement, inspection, all of that. Community Relations, much like the name sounds, they're involved in day-to-day relations, discussions with community members on a whole multitude of issues, air, water, and land. And then you have my office, the Office of Environmental Justice, that is really focused on enhanced public outreach to communities of color, low-income communities throughout the state. One of the cornerstones of enhanced public outreach for us in the Office of Environmental Justice is what I started talking about, which is these environmental justice notification letters. A permit application comes in-house, like it did with Amalsaco. It gets kicked over to my office, and we send out an environmental justice notification letter, which is sort of an early warning letter to any interested parties. And really what's wonderful about that is that it for projects that wouldn't normally have any sort of public notice and comment attached to them, this provides notification that we do have a permit application in-house. Now, of course, we endeavor to send out these letters early in the process, which is what we did here, but it doesn't always mean that the permit's going to be issued. The engineers that review the permits and the Bureau of Air have to take a look at the information, determine if it's appropriate to issue a permit, if there's more information needed, and that type of thing. So sometimes it does happen. We send out an environmental justice notification letter, but ultimately the permit does not issue, which is sort of the situation that we have here with Amalsaco. But nevertheless, I think that it's good that the letter was issued, and we're all here to talk about the Amalsaco situation. I think before I take up all of the 10 minutes, I just wanted to give a brief introduction. I'll turn it over now to Julie Armitage, and she can talk a little bit about the situation with the Amalsaco permitting in line with the EJ notification letter that I sent out.
Thanks, Chris. And can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Julie.
Okay, good. All right, so thanks, Chris, and thanks to the council for the invitation to this evening's meeting and the opportunity to provide information regarding the Amalsaco facility on East University Avenue in Urbana. It's, as some of you may know, it's an emulsified asphalt plant. So the agency's been afforded the initial 10 minutes. Just as Chris was brief, I'm going to try to be brief in my remarks as well. We can always circle back and provide additional information or response to comments or questions, but we'll be brief in our initial remarks, attempting to afford the bulk of the time to any comments or questions that the council or others in attendance may have. I'm going to focus primarily on permitting, as that's the subject matter that gives rise to our presence here at the council meeting this evening. So Emulsicoat, first and foremost, Emulsicoat was and is a raw source. It first became a raw source in 2012, July of 2012 to be exact. Most recently, questions have arisen as to its eligibility for ROS and the process for reentry into a permitting program if ROS eligibility was or were to be lost. But again, ROS eligibility has not been lost, and there is no permit action currently pending, nor does there need to be. This said, just to clarify some of the events that have occurred, there was an application for reentry into the lifetime operating permit program in December of 20. That was based on the fact that there was some concern that the facility may have exceeded eligibility requirements for the ROS program. Then, as Chris mentioned, the customary EJ notification letter was provided to the community based on our receipt of that application. But as it turns out, the facts at hand tell us that that application was not necessary. It was later withdrawn in February. There was a window of time before we got to the bottom of the numbers at issue that the facility was re-entered into the lifetime program. It has since been moved back to the ROS program, and again, that's where it remains. So it was ROS eligible, it remains ROS eligible. Further point of clarification as to the ROS program. So that is a registration program. It's not a permitting program. It's designed to be for the smallest of the sources that we regulate. It became effective in 2012, which is how and why the facility was moved into the program in 12. It's a mandatory program. So if you meet the eligibility criteria, you necessarily have to be in that registration program. And that's in contrast to our permitting programs where there's more flexibility, where a facility can actually be in a program designed for a larger emitter if it so elects. But in this one, you're necessarily where your emissions tell us that you should be. So again, it's a program that's been around for coming up on a decade. It's a mandatory program. It does require annual registration, and as part of that, a source verifies what its emissions have been for the prior year. It does allow some latitude so that sources aren't coming and going in and out of the registration program, such that if your emissions were less than 7 tons in the recent year, you could still stay in, and if they were less than 10 tons in the recent 2 years, you could still stay in. But for all intents and purposes, it's viewed as a program that's designed for sources that emit 5 tons or less overall of all the pollutants combined. The annual fee payment is the verification for the program. So at the point in time when your annual permit fee or registration fee is due, that's when a source would tell us whether they're still eligible for the program or not. Significantly, even when you're in this non-permitting program, in this registration program, you're still otherwise subject to applicable environmental laws and regulations. The eligibility criteria, I briefly touched on those. Again, it's generally speaking less than 5 tons of key pollutants. So the pollutants that we oftentimes hear about, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, ozone. There's a 0.5 ton allowance for hazardous air pollutants. a half-ton allowance for lead, which is a criteria pollutant, but we view it separate from the criteria oftentimes, given the nature of it. And you cannot be subject to a MACT or a NESHAP. So essentially, it's a program designed for facilities that have small emissions, are not subject to rules that apply to larger sources. In terms of some clarifying how the program works, again, there's eligibility criteria. As long as you stay within those and you annually certify that you're still within those, you're necessarily in the program, you're mandatorily in the program. But in the event that you go over, not just the 5 tons, but the 7 tons or the 10 tons that I discussed, which are kind of the buffer criteria so that we're not constantly seeing facilities enter and re-enter. There is a re-entry process, and the re-entry process is not a permit review process. So what happens is most of these sources were at one point in time in our permitting programs, and so that, and most of them were in a lifetime operating permit program. So those permits are, for all intents and purposes, dormant, and during those windows of time when a source exceeds those eligibility criteria, it just reverts or re-enters the lifetime permitting program. But when the numbers drop low enough for re-entry, they're right back out of that lifetime operating program and over into the registration program. So it's not something that the Illinois EPA dreamed up on its own. It is a program that's captured in the statute, and I think that the legislature had in mind resource considerations at the time that it developed this program. I think the notion was these are the sorts of sources that are so small that we want to spare resources for other sources. So let's not put them into the permitting mix. Let's just put them over here in the registration program. Lesser resources then spent on permit review, but again, still sources that have a permit in hand that can come back into play as needed and are otherwise subject to applicable laws and regs. Again, for perspective, in addition to that registration program, there's 3 permitting programs. The smallest of those permitting programs is the lifetime, which is what this facility has in the event that it's not ROS eligible. Then there's the federally enforceable state operating permit program, and then there's the Clean Air Act permitting program. And so they're just a tiered set of permitting programs. The larger the source, the larger the permitting program that they would fall into. For additional information, I know at times there's concerns for what the source's compliance status might be, and not just necessarily limited to ROS eligibility. So in that regard, we recently inspected the source mid-November of last year, and accepting that concern for ROS eligibility, we found that the source was otherwise in compliance with the applicable laws and regs, also the terms of the lifetime permitting program, or the lifetime permit. One additional comment I'll make regarding that inspection that we did is that not only did it confirm the facility's compliance status, but it was a measure of assurance that wouldn't typically be provided for this sort of facility. So generally speaking, the Illinois EPA has a whole host of different statutory mandates, state and federal, that it has to meet. And the bulk of those tend to relate back to the nature and size of facilities. So the bulk of the mandates relate to cap sources, and then lesser so to the fee sub sources, and then even lesser to the lifetime sources, and then in turn to the raw sources. So in terms of inspection obligations, the federal mandates are to inspect the largest sources every 2 years, and then the next tier of sources every 5 years, and then the balance of the sources are inspected as time permits or as need arises. So based on the concern from the public for this facility, we had actually put it on our annual work plan, which again is normally reserved for the larger facilities, but we found it important to go out and ensure that what we thought we knew about the facility matched up. So we did do that in November. Some other information to just put the source into perspective, or put the its location into perspective. Excuse me. So there's what we call national ambient air quality standards that apply to a number of the pollutants that I mentioned earlier, the criteria pollutants, the pollutants that we typically hear about: carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, sulfur oxide, fine particulate matter, ozone. And these national ambient air quality standards, again, they're national, so they're federally established. They apply in all the states. All states have to monitor against these pollutants. We all have continuous ambient monitoring networks throughout our respective states, monitoring against these, telling us how clean our air is or isn't, what the air quality is. And the good news in Illinois is that by and large, our monitors are telling us that there's been significant reductions in emissions, in pollutants, and that we are attainment for these standards. The exceptions are generally for ozone in the 2 metro areas of the state of Illinois. So the Metro East near St. Louis, and then the Chicago metro area. But for Urbana, it's attainment for all pollutants. In fact, I looked at the numbers before I came here, and for example, the fine particulate matter standard, Urbana is 38% below the standard, which is a very good place to be relative to that standard. The nearest ozone monitor is in Bonneville, and that's 13% below the standard. So, and there's monitors for all the pollutants, and most of them are, well, all of them are attaining the standard, and most of them are significantly below the standard. So the point is, the air quality in the area is good. The sources are sufficiently complying with the terms of their permits, the terms of the regulations, the terms of the statutes, such that we can continue to ensure and maintain this level of air quality. And then the last attempt to try and put things into perspective is this. So we, in our world at the Illinois EPA, especially in the Bureau of Air, we tend to talk in terms of criteria pollutants, maybe hazardous pollutants at times, permitting, standards, regulations, whatever. And our general focus tends to be, or at least to this point, tends to be on stationary sources such as emulsicoat as opposed to mobile sources. But one of the things that might help put things into a greater perspective is the carbon dioxide emissions from the facility. So the carbon dioxide emissions from the combustion at the facility are actually less than the average car emits. So if you Google this, and you'll actually, if you Google, you'll probably get this exact stat. The average car emits 4.6 tons of CO2. And this plant, we calculate, emits just over 3 tons of CO2. So in terms of its combustion sources, which are actually one of the more significant sources of the emissions at the facility, and all that's in the context that it's a pretty small facility, the combustion there is less than, but approximate to the emissions from the average car. So that's the information that I'll provide at this point in time. Again, if anyone has comments or questions now, I could address those, or I can address them later.
Julie, thanks for your presentation. We'll address questions after the second presentation. Thank you for the background information and for the informative presentation. But please stay on the line, and we will open this up after hearing from Emulsicoat to public questions. So tonight we have a couple folks on the line from Emulsicoat. Chris McGee is the Executive Vice President for Emulsicoat, and he will be giving a short presentation. I also see Keith Toombs on the call as well, who I believe is a safety manager for the company. Chris and Keith, if you've got a presentation this evening, go right ahead. You're on mute.
Phone. We got too many going on here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You can hear, I can't hear you now, so
We can hear you now. Can you hear us?
all right, can you hear me now? All right.
Yes, we can.
Is it all right if I share my presentation?
Yes, I believe so.
All right, so let me know, can you see that? Looks like it's going. All right, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight. We do have more people in the room at this time. I'd like to introduce them. You've mentioned Keith. Keith is our safety manager. We also have Tony Creek. Tony is retired director of the research group here. He spent 40 years working for the company and has a tremendous amount of knowledge of not only how to work with asphalt, but also many of the other issues we think you'll be looking for tonight. Rick Byers, a local resident there. Rick is vice president of Emulsicoat Urbana. He's in the room with me. We have Sarah Clark, our environmental compliance manager. And my slide is not moving. Next. There we go. Sorry about that. Sarah is our environmental compliance manager with Asphalt Materials. Linda Osborne is the director of analytical research with the Heritage Research Group. We have Rebecca Shaw, who's our industrial hygienist and lab chemist, also with the Heritage Research Group, and myself. And again, thank you very much for inviting us. So here's an overview of the site. We have at the University Avenue, 705 East. This site is constructed on an old railroad storage site some 45 years ago. Emulsicoat has been the name brand since the beginning. We continue with that name brand as a marketing part, but they're part of the Asphalt Materials Group as well as the larger Heritage Group. The Emulsicoat local facility here is part of the Chamber of Commerce. They support various youth athletic teams over the years and are a valued partner with the local road maintenance organizations to help them secure and build better roads. Now, I've tried to answer as many questions in this presentation as we were provided in advance. So it may feel a little bit jerky in terms of we'll head a direction, answer a question, we'll head another direction, but we'll do the best we can to tie it together as a story. Our operations really start by bringing in asphalt binder, otherwise known as asphalt cement, to the plant by a truck and rail. Now, oftentimes you'll hear people talk about roofing tar or coal tar, And I want to make it clear that that is not what we're dealing with here. We don't have coal tar in the plant. We don't have roofing tar. Asphalt binder, asphalt cement would be the types of products that we deal with. They're very different, and it's important that you get into the right category if you're looking up information. The asphalt binder is brought in by a truck, sometimes by a rail. We heat it using natural gas as our energy source. We either boil water or heat a hot oil source. We circulate that steam or hot oil through coils in the tanks to keep it liquid. That material is heated with the natural gas, which is our CO2 source. Now, primarily there are two families of products that come out of the plant. The first is a base asphalt or asphalt cement, and oftentimes a polymer modified cement. And these are used primarily in building road construction or highway, heavy duty type applications. The other family of products are our road preservation products. There are emulsions, and they go on the lower volume, lower weight roads that don't require as robust a support system. Now, one of the questions we had was how many tanks are on site? And so there's 65 tanks in total. 29 are used to store asphalt or asphalt modified, polymer modified. So these are the base asphalts we bring in as raw material, or that polymer modified asphalt that we're selling. 19 of them are used to store the emulsion finished goods. The other 17 are used for raw materials, things like fuel oil, pH modifiers, emulsifiers, surfactants. And surfactants is just a fancy way of saying soap. So there are materials that go into producing those emulsions that we sell. One of the questions that we saw was, how are the tanks inspected? And every month, the tanks are inspected as part of the Spill Prevention and Countermeasures Plan. This is a plan required and overseen by the EPA. But in addition, we have plant team members who are out in the job site, out in the plants all day long. They're constantly monitoring for things that may be inappropriate or not right. They're looking for leaks. They're looking at equipment conditions. They're listening to the sounds of the equipment to see if something's changing. They're looking at the surrounding conditions. So we monitor them monthly based on the requirements, but we're also in the plant every day with the equipment around it, closely part of it. We started talking about the two different operations, and I think this is important that we understand that the polymer modified asphalt is really what you're going to see going onto the highways, the interstates, and things of that nature. We bring this product in via concentrate form from our Cicero, Illinois plant or our Indianapolis, Indiana plant. In the Urbana plant, there at University Avenue, we take the concentrate and we dilute it with other asphalt. And what we're doing is we're diluting that concentrate to make sure it meets the DOT specifications for that very specific application. Roads are designed, they're not all built the exact same way. And so working with the DOT and the owners of the road, we try to make sure we provide the right material for the application. The other product family is the asphalt emulsions. And it starts off with that very same base asphalt. We mix the different asphalts together to get an appropriate characteristic for the product we're making. We then take water, we adjust the pH, we'll add some soaps and emulsifiers and other materials to achieve a specific performance characteristic in the final product. We need all of those things to make it behave the way we want it to behave when it's being used. Finally, those two products, the asphalt and the water, are mixed together in a continuous high shear pump, if you will. That picture on the right is a picture of actually two different mills. The asphalt goes into that silver part of the equipment. The black is the gears and the oiler and the things that keep the bearings that keep the machine running. So it's very simple, very much enclosed. Is there a question?
So sorry, but this is Morgan. I don't see a picture. Is it the same? Did you move your slide forward?
So I'm under, it says current operations, polymer modified asphalt and asphalt
Oh,
emulsion.
I apologize. I had your, actually it was your video was right on top of it. I thought I was missing a slide. Okay.
Okay, all right, no problem. All right, thank you for speaking up.
Please
We just want to make sure
continue. I'm
everybody-
so sorry.
Not a problem. So the reason I wanted to show you the mill was to show you that it's not a huge complex machine. It's not this open vat. It's very much enclosed. And so there really isn't a lot of emissions from that machine itself. speaking of emissions, and so the milling process is not where the emissions come from. The emissions are a result of the storage tanks. One of the questions we had was volatile organic compounds, and they're calculated using software recommended and developed by the EPA, specifically designed to calculate emissions from storage tanks. Now, one of the questions was does that calculation tell us the specific times of VOCs? And the answer is no, it doesn't. All the VOCs are lumped into one criteria, and that calculation then lumps those all up as a total number. So we don't know what the individual components are. This is the way that we are reporting those information. We talked about earlier the CO2. The manufacturing process itself does not create any CO2. The CO2 all comes from the energy to power the steam, to heat the hot oil, to ultimately heat the asphalt and keep it as a molten and at the right temperature. We go back calculating the CO2 by measuring the amount of natural gas that we used, and then we used a emission factor provided by the EPA to calculate the tons of CO2. As was said earlier, our emissions are a fraction of the 25 tons a year regulatory reporting threshold. So I feel like we're doing a pretty good job. We're a small polluter, and it's really just a matter of keeping the asphalt hot. It's not the process itself. Now, one of the questions brought to point a question on one of the forms we submitted, and this last paragraph tries to explain that. But I think it's easier to look at the form itself. And so this is the form that last paragraph is referring to. And there are actually two typos on here. And somebody from the organization found one of the typos. That's listed down at the bottom, where it says actual emissions, tons per month. That should have been tons per year. The calculations are correct. This is a form that we fill out, and we transferred the information over from an Excel spreadsheet where the calculations were done, but we didn't update the header appropriately. The other one is at the top. And while it says actual emissions tons per year, that's another typo, and it should have said potential. And so if you compare on this same chart, what didn't make any sense before, if you multiplied that bottom row by 12 to get tons per year, you realize that the units are the same. The actual emissions that we had are significantly less than those that we identified as potential emissions. So I think that's a pretty good story. One of the things that I spent most of my career in is the chemical processing industry. And this is a very, very different industry. It's not a typical chemical process where you build a process and then you have to actually remove the impurities and you end up with a waste stream or a byproduct. I've made nylon string, I've made paper products, and those had tremendous amounts of waste associated with the production. In our case, 100% of the raw materials end up in the product and are part of building better roads. Base asphalt is a recyclable resource. So even if we make an off-spec batch, we can recover it and reuse it in a different product. I've read that something like 94% of the 2 million miles of roads in the United States are made with asphalt, and it's 100% recyclable. All of that material can be ground up and reused to build the next road, which actually reduces the overall need for more oil by a significant amount. Now, emissions are different from odors. I think there are three different issues we need to talk about when it comes to odors. The first one, asphalt contains as a natural product sulfur, specifically organosulfur materials. Now, organosulfur compounds are naturally occurring in nature. They're in our own bodies, they're in plants, they're in animals, and they are just notoriously odoriferous. They have a smell, depending upon what type it is. Smell of a rotten egg, for example, is a organosulfur product. The smell of a skunk is an organosulfur product. So it can be a very low concentration, but it has a very high notice to your nose. Now, part of the thing of asphalt is it depends on what part of the oil field it comes from. If it has a high sulfur content, it's much more likely to have organosulfurs in the asphalt. And when we heat the asphalt binders emit trace amounts of volatiles that can be odorous. The There can be a sharp odor related to a compound containing sulfur called thiophenes. But these compounds tend to remain in the vent space above hot asphalt and enter in the tank and are only released from the tank whenever we push fresh material into it. And when we're pushing fresh liquid into a tank, those vapors are relieved at the top through an engineered safety-related pressure relief vent at the top of the tank. Now, Emulsicoat has utilized a control device called the mist eliminator. It used this for many years. The piping to this device is connected to those vents from the tank, and we use a blower to pull the air that's displaced out of those tanks and into that mist eliminator. One of the things we're doing right now is we're currently replacing and upgrading that vent pipe so it does a better job of collecting and routing these odors to the mist eliminators, and hopefully improving and reducing the impact of those odors. As we're going to talk about a little bit later, we're also planning to move some of the production to the saline facility, which will reduce the amount of material, or the amount of asphalt specifically, that's moving from tank to tank, reducing the load on this mist eliminator. The second event that I think is important we talk about are the end of season activities. At the end of the year, fresh material is added to the first emulsion tank to clean it and prepare it for winter. That material is then moved to the second, and so on and so forth, until all of those tanks have been cleaned and are ready for winter storage. That accumulated flush material is then moved to a single tank. The combined cleanings from these tanks are heated to 212 degrees to remove the water, and the asphalt emulsion and the recovered hot asphalt binder is then stored for the winter for future runs. In the fall of 2020, the odors appear to be a result of heating emulsifiers, or the soaps that we use in this emulsification process, higher than normal, resulting in odor after the water had been removed. Emulsicoat is evaluating options to discontinue this activity at the University Avenue facility. There's a third group of orders that appeared this year, and we've heard reports of, and we actually identified it or smelled ourselves. It reportedly has a smell of a natural gas type odor. We've had the natural gas supplier visit the plant numerous times to try to identify the source. We've not found any leaks as of yet. This is the first year that the plant has observed this odor. And we've not observed this odor at any of our other facilities. In fact, we have several other employees who have worked at other asphalt companies, and this is a new odor to them as well. This odor seems to be occurring when the wind is blowing from the north and may not be from our facility, but it may be passing through our facility. We're committed to trying to determine what this odor is coming from. So we've been doing some air sampling. And after we collected 11 air samples for 4 hours, we were not able to detect any peaks. So then we set up more samplings. And after 24-hour samples were collected, we still weren't able to detect anything. So now we're expanding our sample. We're collecting samples for an entire week, and we're still waiting to get those results back. But hopefully we're going to find a fingerprint that can point us in the right direction to what is causing this last odor. We're committed to finding this and to helping understand where it's coming from, and if it's us, addressing it appropriately. Now, one of the questions that we got asked was, can you predict when the odors are going to occur? The answer is, given the wind, the weather, the humidity, barometric changes, where does the material come from, and what material movements are happening, I can't tell exactly when an odor is going to happen. But if you look at our business, in June, July, August, and September, 78% of our work occurs in those 4 months. It's a pretty safe bet that that's when we're going to have issues. And in fact, if you extend it out a month each way, 95% of our sales occur in those 6 months. And I think you'll find that that lines up very much with what you're seeing or smelling. I don't think it's anything other than that. It's just that that's where we're doing the work, and that's when the opportunities present themselves. One of the questions was, why so much this year versus before? The answer is the volumes in 2020 were up, and up a lot. We compare it to 2018, total product moved through the plant was up 59%. Now, the emulsions that moved through the plant were up only 33%, but the asphalt products, those products that have to be kept the hottest, were up 112%. COVID played a role in that, Less traffic on the roads meant it was easier to do the road work, and more work was completed, so they needed more asphalt. Municipalities and states are also doing more infrastructure work, increasing the demand for asphalt and PMA. More asphalt moving through the plant creates more opportunities for odors to escape. Nothing that is surprising there. The production process itself doesn't contribute to it. It really is just moving material into the tanks and through the tanks. So I know one of the big concerns is the expansion at Saline Court. Best I can tell, in the 2014-2015 timeframe, there was a conversation with the Transit Authority about purchasing the University Avenue property and Mulsicote moving all operations to the Saline Court facility. That conversation did not lead to a successful agreement. Moving the entire plant is simply not economical or feasible for either side. However, with the growth, we are in the process of expanding our Saline Court capabilities to help deal with the increase in asphalt sales. This will allow us to move those PMA and asphalt binder sales out of University Avenue to Saline Court, reducing the volumes at University Avenue. Now, this transition is on schedule. It's a huge project, a lot of construction, and we will expect to complete it in the summer of 2022. But for the record, there are no current plans to move the emulsion facility to Saline Court. There's just not an economical solution that allows for that to happen. Now, what does that mean, moving the asphalt binder out of University Avenue to Saline Court? So the graph I showed you earlier here, without the box around it, kind of helps tell that story. The blue bars are the amount of asphalt sales we had as a percent of outflow from the plant. The asphalt binder is represented by the red lines on top. If we move the asphalt binder out of the plant, which is our plan, those red lines will go off and the total production will come down. Now, one of the amazing things about this is that the asphalt emulsions are actually partly water. And so the overall reduction will reduce the total amount of asphalt, given the 2020 sales that go through that plant, by 55%. A pretty significant reduction. A 55% reduction in total asphalt through the plant is what we're shooting for based on 2020 sales. Again, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your patience.
Chris, thank you for your presentation this evening. That was also very informative. Let's see. Okay. So at this point in the evening, we are going to move into questions from attendees. And I'd like to start with questions from our attendees first, and we'll move through some questions that way. I would request that attendees keep their comments and questions to about 3 minutes. I'll start by taking 5 questions, and our guests perhaps can keep track, or I can remind them of the questions, and then kind of answer those questions in a batch from the first 5, and then we can kind of move on to another 5, and so on and so forth. We will have so far maybe about 45 minutes to do that, but we'll see as we go. So if any of the attendees would like to ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand through the Zoom function, and I will call on those that I see. Okay, so far I don't see anyone having had raised their hands out of the attendees. Perhaps maybe folks are being a little shy, and that's okay. I'll open it up to kind of the commission members. Do any commission members have questions or comments? Grace.
Thanks. And then Tomas's hand is there too. It blends in with your yellow background though. Question about units. In a lot of the literature for environmental stuff, I think a lot of things are in milligrams per cubic meter. And I know that, would have to do with the distance from the source of the emissions, but I didn't know if you had any idea how that works or expected, how many tons per year, what your local concentration of emissions might look like. And if that's not a relevant unit comparison, let me know that too.
Grace, is that for the EPA or for Emulsicoat?
Yes, either, both.
And was there a particular pollutant that you were interested in terms of what the unit measurements were?
Not in particular, I mean, any of them really, but a lot of some of the literature looking at the effects on health are measured in a concentration like that. And we've only gotten units in tons per year, so I'm just not sure how that correlates.
Good question. I'm wondering if Chris or Julie would like to kind of start with answering that one.
Yeah, I'll, can you hear me?
Yeah, Julie, go ahead.
So I'll start. So since we've all, I guess you'd say, have had some awareness, and maybe somewhat limited, but some awareness that at least some modifications to the University Avenue facility would be occurring. But just now in the presentation, I think there was more light shed on that. So I think it's going to have to be the facility, if they're able to tonight, that might speak to what they think that means in terms of the numbers. I mean, there's no doubt but what it means the emissions are reduced. I don't know that you can just do a direct correlation and say they necessarily reduce by, the 55% or some other percent. I think there would have to be some calculations, but they may have already done those or could maybe quickly do a back of the envelope calculation and give us some perspective on that. But as to the concentration, so the way that works is as follows, or at least in my experience with the Illinois EPA Bureau of Air. So when we're looking at regulating a facility, almost always we're speaking in terms of pounds and tons. So there's 2,000 pounds in a ton. More often than not, we're speaking in terms of tons or fractions of tons. And that's what helps us decide whether we are triggering rules, whether we're triggering permitting programs, where that facility fits in the scheme of our overall emissions impact on air quality in Illinois. But then when we try to figure out what the impact of a particular facility is in other than tons, for example, in concentrations, then the manner in which we go about that is by way of modeling. So then for that exercise, we look to information, some of which we are acquiring from facilities through the permitting process. Other times we have to acquire the information through other means. But in any event, we're looking then at more particulars regarding where that facility is located, what its stack height is, what any downwash might be from the facility. But essentially, we're modeling what the emissions out any stacks would be, during steady state operations, or if it's fugitive emissions that we're talking about, we would do the same. We're trying to figure out where those fugitive emission sources are on a property, and what concentrations would there be off-site and at what points off-site. And of course, we're going to refer to those off-site points as receptors, but that's a whole nother exercise. So we tend to say that we only arrive at concentrational type impacts from our facility when we've done a modeling exercise using information in terms of emission rates and, again, particulars relative to the facility. So what size is the facility, what sizes are its stacks, what's the terrain like, what's the geography like, we've got to factor in met conditions and all sorts of things. So hopefully that puts it into some perspective. So I know Illinois EPA could not speak to what the impact of this facility is offsite in terms of concentrations without doing that sort of exercise. I don't know if the facility would have a different reaction, but that certainly would be our position on the matter. One additional thing that I'll add is that we would only get to that point. We tend to get to that point, I'll say, if we are talking about major new sources. And by major new sources, I mean not just sources that are major for purposes of determining which permitting program they're in, such as the Clean Air Act permitting program, but major sources that are triggering federal requirements where they have to put in best available control technology and whatever. So the biggest of the majors, the most major of the majors. So in those scenarios, we would be doing those sorts of analyses, or if there was some reason to think that a particular facility was emitting a particular pollutant or pollutants, and those were giving us some reason to believe that there might be an adverse impact of some sort. It's certainly, so I'll leave it at that. So it's a sort of exercise that with a facility of this type and this size, it isn't something that would typically be envisioned, this modeling exercise. But that's not to say that we otherwise can't figure out what their emissions look like. But when you get into that, what are the concentrations, then normally when you're doing that, which takes me back to what I said about I'm normally doing that sort of modeling in the context of permitting the biggest of the bigs. And when I'm doing the modeling and figuring out what the concentrations are, then I'm comparing those concentrations to some otherwise applicable standard. So the standards you oftentimes would compare those back to are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for the criteria pollutants. There's times when there's standards for certain of the HAPs, but essentially what you're looking at is to see whether there's either an environmental concern in terms of the concentration or a health concern in terms of the concentration. But for the concentration to be meaningful, or most meaningful, you have to have something against which to compare it. And in this instance, there would be some difficulty in that regard. So for example, we already know that if I compared a concentration of one of the criteria pollutants offsite, it would tell me that the source does not create any attainment issues, because I already know by way of my monitors that I've got attainment in that area. So we can rule that out. And then we already know that they're in compliance with all of the applicable laws and regs, so we can rule that out. So, you know, if you got into this, you'd have to see whether there's some other standards against which I would be making the comparison. And that just gets into many layers of difficulty, and whether even if I can find some benchmarks, reference points, reference levels against which to compare these concentrations, then it begs the question what it still is telling me, because oftentimes these other benchmarks aren't necessarily enforceable. They're just something that you can eyeball and say, well, it's equal to this benchmark, it's greater than the benchmark, it's less than the benchmark. If it's, presumably if it's equal to or less than, then oftentimes people would conclude, well, maybe there's no issue, but, I think some debate that. If it's greater than the benchmark, then oftentimes there's some expectation that something would be done. But again, if it's not a benchmark or reference point that is an established state or federal standard, then we get into these additional discussions. So that's kind of the perspective on that offsite concentration concept. But I think I'll turn it over to the facility to see if they have something to say about the emissions in terms of pounds or tons that we might expect to be reduced, or if they have anything else to add in terms of concentrations.
In the meantime, I would just add, it looks like there are some benchmarks, like
Right.
says that about 1 milligram per cubic meter particulates and 0.3 milligrams cubic meter benzene soluble particles has shown irritation in the lower respiratory tract for workers in open air asphalt processing plants.
So can you hear me now?
Who's speaking? I see a phone number.
All right, this is Chris McGee. We switched over to
Got
an
it.
area phone so that more people can speak.
Got it.
Yeah, I don't know that you can directly correlate a tons per milligram per cubic liter, and those are basically a way of saying parts per million. What I think you can argue, because you don't know the wind speed, the wind direction, just so many different factors, the modeling that was spoke of, the total tons will give you an idea of the activity that we're emitting, if you will. I think it's a good comparison. The cubic or the parts per million is more about the exposure. And we've done industrial hygiene testing on those things that you mentioned with people in the plants, at our fence line. Those types of tests would be capturing a known volume of air, identifying a known amount of material in there, and capturing them and reporting them in the types of metrics you used. And we are within those standards every time we've tested those at our plant.
Okay. I'm gonna, just for folks who are joining us, we are in the public Q&A section where any attendee may raise their hand and make a comment or ask a question. If we get a lot of hands, we may do some batching of these questions, but so far we've not had a lot of questions. So if any attendee would like to make a comment or ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand using the Zoom function. All right, I see a question from Chandra Bishop. Chandra, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. When Julie, I believe, was speaking from IEPA, she mentioned the different measurements for permit usage, I guess, 5 tons or under 7 tons. Who measures those outputs? Is it self-reporting? And from your inspection in November 2020, did you notice any difference in the amount of output that Emulsicoat put out, I guess, than the previous year or the previous inspection?
So a couple of things. As with most of what we tend to look at, facilities oftentimes, or their consultants oftentimes prepare the information and then it's reviewed by us. So in this instance, that's what happens, and that's what happened. So the facility calculated the emissions, shared them with us, and the inspector took a look at them. So I think it was, I would say that since the information was provided, I believe, at the inspection or as an outgrowth of the inspection, it's really more us looking at the records as opposed to it being reported information. But you know, that's probably a distinction without a whole lot of merit, but it was facility information that was provided to us. I don't, at least based on my conversations with the inspector and a review of the inspection report, I don't know that he necessarily noted an increase in throughput or something like that. That's not to say that it didn't happen. It just isn't something that I recall him making mention of. It's probably a better question for the facility. I will say this though, I think that the numbers that we were taking a look at, the issue that we ran into wasn't so much that the numbers increased because the numbers that we were looking at on the page that were causing us to think that maybe Ross eligibility had been exceeded. The issue there wasn't a function of increase in throughput or change in something else. It was really more a function of the manner in which the numbers were calculated. And so whether you're Ross eligible, whether you need to be in lifetime permitting, that's really a permitting question. And so I turned the matter over to the permit section and then had the facility work with the permit section to ensure that we were actually all on the same page in terms of how the emissions were calculated, which is the page we ultimately got to. And it was then that we realized that essentially the facility was, I think it's fair to say they were over-calculating the emissions as opposed to under-calculating them. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Next question from the audience, from attendees this evening. I see Charles has their hand raised. Charles, you're on mute, but go ahead.
How about now?
We can hear you.
Okay. My question is for the gentleman from the Mosscoat facility.
Oh, hold on just a second. Your mic is really hot. It's very high. Are you able to dial that back just a little bit?
Is that better?
Much. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. My question is for the gentleman from the Mosscoat facility. It is about the testing that you do at the fence line, the locations where you take your sampling, how the sensors themselves or the collection devices, how far above the ground is it? And where around your perimeter do you take those samples?
Okay, I believe that.
Right. So I think I finally got us unmuted.
Yes.
So the answer is that we try to place those monitors at basically head height. So they're representing what an average employee would be. So like their shoulders, they're on their chest, if you would, or if they're on the fence, the same height as would be a standing person.
And I believe there was a second piece, which was a kind of which around the perimeter are you testing on which sides of your facility or all sides?
What about the perimeter?
We were all around.
So they're walking,
The
it's not
entire-
stationary?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So we're using the sampler on the people and they are walking along the parameter is not necessarily a single point that we're doing that sampling from.
Okay, thank you. Tomas Delgado had his hand raised earlier.
Yeah, this was another question for Chris. Kind of just going back to the narrative that you had shared when you had given us background concerning the cleaning of the emulsion equipment in preparation for winter. I just wanted to get clarification on how was that relevant to the odor disturbance, or was that referenced because that process was occurring at the same time as the disturbance, or how does that kind of weave into the background that you had shared and then what actually occurred?
So I think that we've got 3 different events from the odor, and this was the second one I was talking to. I think there was some extra complaints or complaints this fall. When there wasn't a lot of activity in the plant, we were shutting down, and those were a result of this boil-off process where we were cleaning those tanks and then recovering the asphalt. So that's the reason I wanted to explain this. I think that we've got one that occurs during the heat of the season when we're moving a lot of material. This situation created another opportunity, and then the third opportunity that we've heard about lately that we don't have an answer for.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question related to that. Do you guys do the air quality test when you're using that cleaning equipment? Have you done any testing like when you're doing a quote unquote boil off?
I do not have data at my hands to say that, so I'm not aware of any testing that was done during that recovery period.
Grace, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was just in the same realm. I think Jess kind of already got some of the answers about that industrial air hygiene test. And I guess you said you don't have the data in front of you, but I was wondering if you know if that measured different types of particulate matter and total particulate matter. And yeah, I was curious what those numbers are, but I guess you said you don't have them in front of you.
So what I was referring to was specifically during that operation in the fall when we were boiling the water off. I don't have the testing for that. We do have testing for our employees through regular industrial hygiene testing and at the fence line during normal operations. That's a once-a-year operation. It is not normal, and it's not part of our ongoing day-to-day operations.
Do you have those numbers available?
Let us look, see if we've got those with us.
Okay. While you're looking for those numbers, a follow-up question that I have from sort of the industrial hygiene in that vein, and this is a question related to that. What kind of monitor, not like the brand specifically, but what are the gases or materials that are being measured on the wearable monitors by your staff that are walking around your facility? I'm familiar with some because of just some indoor air work that I do, where we would have somebody use like a 4-gas monitor, for example, go into a crawl space of a home. So I'm just curious what kind of monitors. I'm also familiar with carbon monoxide monitors or wearables. What are those devices and what are you measuring?
All right, so I'm going to defer to Linda Osborne, our Director of Analytical Research. She's got a much better handle on the details.
Great.
So during the summer months, we visit the plants and monitor the workers for what is called benzene soluble matter. or benzene soluble fraction. And that is the only NIOSH method that is, it's part of NIOSH method 5042. And for that method, we also measure total particulates. So with the same sampler, we get total particulates and benzene soluble fraction of what the workers are exposed to. So these are non-specific tests. They only give a gravimetric number, which we report. And if those exceed 0.5 milligrams per cubic meter, then that is recommended as a threshold limit value. So for the, because we are a research group and we've done a significant amount of asphalt fume research globally over the past 20 years, we also do extra testing on the workers to look for specifically polycyclic aromatic compounds. We look for hydrogen sulfide, and any, those are the primary ones that we look for. So we also do a test called fluorescence, which we've learned correlates with the carcinogenicity of the of potential oils. So we are doing a lot of extra work and monitoring them. So that's, we report all of these results to the plants. Benzene solubles is not benzene compounds, it's what is soluble in benzene. Benzene's used as the lab solvent to determine what fraction might be harmful to the workers. So that's what we monitor.
Did you give us the numbers for emulsicote, or are you saying it's below that 0.5 milligrams per cubic meter?
Sure. This was for 2019, the minimum result was 0.08 milligrams per cubic meter. That was for total particulates. And the maximum was 1.57 milligram per cubic meter. For benzene soluble fraction, it was 0.09 for a min and 0.15 for a max. Or I'm sorry, it was DDL for the minimum, 0.09 for the max, and the worker average was, oh, the screen went dead.
And
Oh,
BDL is below detection limit, is that correct?
That's correct, I'm sorry. And then we did not detect any hydrogen sulfide on any of the workers.
Okay, for attendees and panelists both, we are still in public comment and questions. If anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can go ahead and raise your hand using the Zoom function to raise your hand.
Stacy, I'm sorry, but I don't know how to find that Zoom function, so I'm just going to chime in. I just had a few quick questions. So my first question is how much time, so you mentioned in the PowerPoint presentation that the Illinois EPA oversees this process. I'm just wondering how much actual time is spent, like how much time does the EPA or IEPA spend at the facility in a given year. And, you know, just thinking about, like, I'm sure there's lots of companies that they're probably having to oversee. Just wondering how much time is spent. And then you said that people are monitoring the facility at all times. Is that a specific job, or that's just an extra added, you know, duty that people are supposed to do while they're working?
I believe that that's a question for the EPA.
Well, so I'm not really certain whether the question is specific to this facility or general, so I'll put it all together. So as I mentioned earlier, this is and has been a source that's required to be registered with the Illinois EPA, as opposed to a source that's required to be permitted by the IEPA. And again, the significance of that is its size. It's literally one of the smallest types of facilities in the state. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's this registration program, then 3 different permitting programs: the lifetime permitting program, then the FESOP, Federally Enforceable State Operating Permit program, and then the CAP program, or the Clean Air Act permitting program. And those were in ascending order, going from smallest to biggest programs. So again, we're an agency that runs largely on state or federal mandates, and our mandates are to ensure that all facilities are appropriately permitted and all facilities are appropriately regulated by us. Otherwise stated, we have to ensure that anyone that needs to be in the registry program is in the registry program, and anyone that requires a particular type of permit has that type of permit. And then we further have to ensure that facilities stay within the requirements of the registry program, or within the requirements of these permitting programs, or the otherwise applicable laws and regulations, which the otherwise applicable laws and regulations are really what the terms that appear on the face of these permits. So that's where you see the emissions limits or the emission standards. So in terms of the and that's a lot, and that's on top of so that's permitting, that's compliance work, that's field inspection work, and then of course that's on top of regulatory work, creating new laws, creating new rules, or the air quality work that we do, the monitor stations that we have set up throughout the state, and then the planning and modeling and whatever else that we're doing. So specific to inspections, we're obligated to inspect the CAP sources, and we're obligated to inspect the FESOP sources by the federal government. So we have 477 CAP permitted facilities and 793 federally enforceable state operating permit facilities. And then there's the rest of the facilities, lifetimes or registered sources. The CAP permits have to be inspected every 2 years, and the FESOP sources have to be inspected at least every 5 years. And then the rest of the facilities are inspected as needed, perhaps in response to complaints, et cetera. And so we have to, and at any given point in time in the AIR program, I have maybe 15 inspectors to do the inspection work. And so we have to be pretty judicious about, you know, how much time is spent on any one facility. And it's a stretch for us to get to the CAP sources and the FESOP sources on the schedule. So we're pretty smart about, you know, or we try to be pretty smart about where we're going and when we're going and what we're doing when we're there and what we're doing when we're back here. We try to run a lot of our evaluations by way of reports that come into us. A lot of the rules, a lot of these permits call for reports from facilities. All those reports are logged and reviewed by us. So we look to those things. We look to complaints, the existence of or lack of complaints. We look to the air quality monitoring. We look to any sources of information that we can to try and ensure that these facilities are in compliance. We get annual emission reports from all but the registered sources, but again, the registered sources have to tell us as part of their annual fee payments whether they're still where they need to be in terms of eligibility. They're otherwise subject to these rules and regs. So in terms of time spent at any one facility, at this facility, it would not be the subject of a mandatory routine frequency inspection. Rather, it's the sort of thing that we would inspect every so many years just to keep, keep a presence at the facility or in response to complaints. At the largest of the sources, it's very difficult for us to be there, as I say, at the 2-year point, and certainly we're not there more frequently. So the time actually physically at the sources is, in the scheme of things, somewhat limited, but again, that doesn't mean that that's the only source of information that we have on these facilities. An awful lot of information comes to us by way of reports, and then we have some other sources of information. So we actively keep an eye on that, but time spent at a facility, even a high priority facility that we're mandated to be there, if measured in hours or days, it's a fraction of the time in a given year or a given 2-year period or even 5-year period. But again, that does not necessarily mean that we're not otherwise monitoring, and I use that word loosely, meaning just keeping an eye on the facility.
That must be very stressful work. So just one quick question then. As far as like the reports that you're referring to, these are the reports from the Heritage Research Group that's owned by the company. Is that the reports that you're referring to?
So, so we'll take the reports from any source, be it a MOLSA code or any facility, from the facility itself or any representatives of the facility, which could include parent companies, or it could include third-party consultants. So there's an array of representatives on behalf of this facility or any other facility who are in a position to provide us information and do provide us information. But again, as long as it's the source of the information is a source that we can accept the information from, then it's all logged, reviewed, and whatever by us. So in this instance, I will tell you, I didn't actually pay heed to exactly who was, whose letterhead was, the information was printed on, or who was signing the information, but it was all submitted on behalf of the facility. So.
Thank you. I did have one other question, but I don't want to monopolize time, Stacy, so I can hold it or ask it now.
I want to give Andy a chance to ask a question, and then Jess, we can come back to you.
Hi, Andrew Stumpf here. I guess it's a question for everybody, either party. So if we have a question, or if we have a concern, who should we contact about that? I live in the neighborhood. I'm about 10 blocks away from the plant, and I know that our neighborhood has a Historic East Urbana Facebook page, so there's a lot of communication going on within the neighborhood. So I know a lot of times last summer, when there was the issue of the smell about natural gas, a lot of those questions got sent to the council person's email or to the Facebook page in general. So there's lots of activity within the neighborhood wondering what was going on. And so if the company knew there was a smell issue, could they notify the council person of this so that they can communicate that?
So this is Julie Armitage from my EPA. I'll take a crack at this, and then clearly the source will need to respond as well. But for us, and if Brad or Chris want to weigh in on this, that's fine. But for the Illinois EPA, we consider one of our greatest tools, one of our greatest resources is the public, the citizens that reside in and around facilities. So we consider that the feedback from the citizens a great source of information. So we encourage communications of whatever sort as often as you're interested or capable or feel are necessary. Generally, we'll have those communications routed into the Office of Community Relations, which Brad oversees. But this community is in it is potentially an EJ community, and so it would not be inappropriate for you to potentially reach out to Chris Presnell as well. We have the ability for you to contact us by phone, or certainly there can be email access, there can be online complaints or comments or questions provided us. There's the Freedom of Information Act that through which you can seek information from us of whatever type. And I think at times people are surprised by how helpful that process can be. It moves pretty quickly, and there's a lot more information than I think people could ever begin to realize available. And some of it can be confusing, but some of it can be very enlightening and helpful. So for us, that would always be the first point of communication. And then depending upon what your comment or question or issue or concern may be, it's certainly a practice that we have, that of reaching out to local officials. Local units of government, state official, elected officials, whatever, happy to communicate with whomever. So again, that's something that Brad or Chris could do. So that's how we would recommend that you would run it. And of course, when the comments, questions, or other come into us, Brad and Chris, as Chris mentioned early on, we all work very closely, so they know who might be the best in the best position to address whatever you're asking. If it's something that we just need to provide you with some documentation, then we'll pass you on to FOIA, but it's not uncommon for us to say to our records department, here's what I think they're looking for, here's some information that we think would be useful, and we essentially set that aside for them to provide to you. Or if it's a question that's technical in nature and better suited for the Bureau, then it might come on over to me or to one of the other bureaus. Or if it's, something else, it might be that Chris or Brad or their staff are directly assisting you. So we've got a pretty robust process set up to deal with this, and then to provide either documents or responses to the questions, or to reach out to you, or to again reach out to the city or whomever might be appropriate. So Chris or Brad, did you have anything to add to that? Or
Well, yeah, I guess I would add that, yeah, that's all right. You can find our information online, my information, Brad and his team's information online. And I think Chris McGee was getting ready to say something. So I'll kind of let him talk. But yes, in a perfect world, we're all all of us are sort of all communicating with each other. And obviously if the folks in the neighborhood are experiencing odors and there's a way to contact the company, or it filters through us and we contact. So all of the communication, because we're in Springfield, so speed is of the essence. If there might be an issue in helping, hopefully the company would know what was going on if it was the company, or could rule it out.
So
I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but yeah, Brad.
yeah, so I think between Julie and Chris, they covered most of it. I just wanted, kind of just clarify that, if you have a complaint, if let's say you experience an odor and you want to report that to the agency. So on our website, on the front page of our website, we've got some quick links, and one of them takes you to our complaint form. And the form has it has all the information we need. So if you have a complaint, really, that's the place to start. And, that kind of gives us the information that we need to know about the severity, or how frequently you're experiencing it, or how many people are experiencing it. But it's information that we need. Now, as Julie said, if you're more of the, well, I have a question about something, that's where it's probably better to call up myself or Chris, and we can answer your question or research your question or what have you. And then, as Julie said, if you're looking for documents, that's where you would go over to the FOIA. But certainly, if you have questions about any of that process, you'll call, and either myself or one of my staff can certainly provide you that information that you're looking for.
Okay, I believe that Chris McGee was also going to respond.
Thank you. Yeah, there were a couple of questions in there, or at least I thought there were. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but I thought one of the questions was, could we kind of predict and let you know? And I just don't think we can do that. We are not necessarily out in the community, and the wind direction plays a huge role in it. Unless one of our people actually would happen to be downwind of the odor, I just don't think we're going to know it. So I think the answer that you were provided is probably the best answer. It's documented. It's not going away. They're going to follow up on it. They're going to get a hold of us. And I think you can be more assured by following that process. Would be happy to take a call sometime if you think it can help. But I think that they've given you a lot better resources than I can offer in terms of the information and the data that they can provide. If you want to know more about the operation, be happy to share more information about that. But I just don't think we can predict an odor. We don't have enough of a knowledge of what's going on in terms of when it happens, what's the asphalt, what's the weather, which way is the wind blowing, to be able to predict that.
Okay, thank you. I think we're gonna head towards wrapping up. Are there any further questions? Grace, go ahead.
Thanks. This is a question for Emulsicoat representatives. I'm kind of wondering what are some of the solutions? Sounds like I heard you say that you were going to move a certain aspect of the operations to another plant further outside of town, and expect that will help with next summer's, or I guess this summer's increase in season, I guess. Investigating some of those other odors that are potentially natural gas that you think might be coming from somewhere else. And just kind of if that's a correct recap. And then my other question is, what about the tank cleaning? Is there more filtering or scrubbing that can be done for when those tanks are cleaned or purged?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So yeah, the movement of the material from University Avenue to Saline Court should occur for the season 22, not 21. The project is just too big to get done in that time frame. What that will do is it'll remove a lot of the base asphalt movements and the PMA movements that are creating those opportunities for odor to escape. We continue to investigate the natural gas smell. We have had the supplier of natural gas at the site, cannot find any leaks. And this is the first year that our folks have smelled it. So we're still looking for that. Hopefully some of the longer tests will show something. We were talking earlier tonight if we could maybe focus in on what if we tried to predict what it might be. Would that be easier to find? But we're not going to give up on that. We're going to continue looking for it. We don't know what it is. We don't think it's us. And we'd like to help solve that problem. The plan as far as the boil out, we're looking to eliminate that, move that off-site to a different location. We believe it's feasible. I just don't want to commit to that right now, but our best efforts will be to not do that there in the future. Again, that's best efforts. I don't want to commit it in stone at this point in time, but we are evaluating that and trying to make that happen.
I believe that that is all that we have time for this evening. I'd like to kind of thank both members of Emulsicoat for joining us this evening, as well as staff from the Illinois EPA. I'd like to just give an opportunity for Emulsicoat and the IEPA to say any last comments that they'd like to. I'm certainly not an expert on air quality, emissions, and pollutants, and so kind of maybe one question, just food for thought, is, you know, if I'm a layperson here, what questions should I have been asking? What questions should we be asking? Did we miss anything here that you really wanted to answer here tonight?
No, I think you've done a pretty thorough job of looking at what's going on, the increase in sales, the move of that part of the plant. I just want to say I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the conversation tonight. I think it's important. We want to be good neighbors. We want to be corporate stewards. We want to do the right thing, and this is a good way to get us started. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate you letting us join as a group. Thank you.
Yeah, I would sort of say the same thing. I think we've done a good job of covering it. But then if we didn't, or something comes up from any of the commission members or any members of the public, as we've said, I think plenty of times, please reach out to the Illinois EPA, any one of Brad and I or his staff, and we'll work and try to find information, whether it's on this issue or any other issue in that community. That's what we're here for.
Okay, so once again, thank you to our guests this evening, and thank you to the attendees as well that joined in and asked questions and thought about maybe some next steps and any further questions. Please reach out to, you can reach out to myself. My information is on the Sustainability Advisory Commission website if you have any questions as a follow-up to the meeting this evening. And yeah, just thanks for all for being here. I think with no further business before the commission this evening, that we will wrap things up and call the SAC meeting adjourned.